druk. Good. Welcome. Very well. In this village, when the ripened ears of wheat sway in the breeze, it is said that the wolf runs through them. This is because one can make out the form of a running wolf in the shifting stalk of wheat fields. When the wind is too strong and the stalks are blown over, it is said that the wolf has trampled them. When the harvest is poor, this is said that the wolf has eaten it. It was a nice turn of phrase, but it had a troublesome aspect that flawed it, she felt. Still, lately it was a popular sort of expression, and there were few remaining who wielded it with the sort of familiarity or awe it had held in the past. Although the autumn sky that was visible between the swaying stalks of wheat had not changed in hundreds of years. Conditions below that sky had indeed changed. The villagers who tended the wheat as the years passed lived for 70 years at most. Perhaps it would be worse for them to go centuries without changing. Maybe that is why there is no need for them to honor the ancient agreement, she thought. In any case, she knew she no longer had a place here. The mountains that rose in the east caused the clouds over the village to drift mostly north. She thought of her homeland beyond those drifting clouds and sighed. Returning her gaze to the sky, from the sky to the fields, her eyes fell upon the magnificent tail, which twitched just past her nose. Nothing better to do, she set to grooming it. The autumn sky was high and clear. Harvest time had come again. Many wolves were running through the wheat fields. Chapter 1. So that's the last then? Looks like 70 pelts on the nose. Always a pleasure. Hey, anytime. You're the only one who'll come this far into the mountains, Lawrence. I should be thanking you. But for my trouble to get truly fine pelts, I'll come again. But for my trouble, I get truly fine pelts. I'll come again. The usual pleasantries concluded. Lawrence managed to leave the village just around 5 o'clock. The sun was just beginning to climb when he left, and it was midday by the time he descended from the mountains and entered the plains. The weather was good. There was no wind. It was a perfect day for dozing in the wagon as he crossed the plains. It seemed absurd that only recently he had felt the chill of the approaching winter. This was Lawrence's 70th year as a traveling merchant, and his 25th since birth. He gave a huge yawn in the driver's box. There were few grasses or trees of any notable height, so he had an expansive view. At the very edge of his field of vision, he could see a monastery that had been built some years earlier. He didn't know that what young noble had cloistered in this remote location. The masonry of the building was magnificent, and unbelievably, it even had an iron gate. Lawrence seemed to remember that roughly 20 monks lived there, attended by a similar number of manservants. When the monastery had been first built, Lawrence had anticipated fresh clientele. The monks were somehow able to secure supplies without employing independent merchants. Though, so his dreams were fleeting. Admittedly, the monks lived simply, tilling their fields so trade with them would not be especially profitable. There was another problem in that they would probably solicit donations and leave their bills unpaid. As far as simple trade went, they were the worst partners. They were worse partners than out-and-out thieves. Still, there were times when trade with them was convenient. Thus, Lawrence looked in the direction of the monastery with some small regret, but then narrowed his eyes. From the direction of the monastery, someone was waving at him. "What's this?" The figure did not look like a manservant. They wore dark brown work clothes. The waving figure was covered in grey clothing. His deliberate approach likely meant some hassle, but ignoring him could make matters worse later. Lawrence reluctantly turned his horse toward the figure. Perhaps, having realized that Lawrence was now headed his way, the figure stopped waving, but made no move to approach. He appeared to be waiting for the cart's arrival. It would hardly be the first time that a church associate demonstrated arrogance. Lawrence was in no mood to take every insult personally. As he approached the monastery, the figure became clearer. Lawrence muttered in spite of himself, "A knight?" He at first dismissed the idea as ridiculous, but as he drew nearer, he saw that it was unmistakably a knight. The grey clothing was in fact silver armor. "You there! What's your business here?" The distance between them was still too far for conversation, which is why the knight yelled. He apparently which is why the knight yelled. He apparently felt no need to introduce himself, as if his position were obvious. "I am Lawrence, a traveling merchant. Do you require my service?" The monastery was now directly in front of him. He was close enough to count the number of servants working the fields. To the south, fields to the south. He also noted that the knight in front of him was not alone. There was another one past the monastery, perhaps standing guard. "A merchant. There's no town in the direction you came from. Merchant," the knight said heartedly. Un momento. Daar. Sticking out his chest as if he was to display the golden cross that engraved there. But the mantle draped on his shoulders was grey, indicating a knight of low rank. His blonde hair looked freshly cut, and his body did not look as if it had been through many battles. So his pride mostly likely came from being a new knight. It was important to deal with such men carefully. They tended to be excitable. So instead of replying, Lawrence took a leather pouch out of his breast pocket and slowly undid the twine and that held it close. Inside were candies made of crystallized honey. He plucked one out and popped it into his mouth, then offered the open bag to the knight. Careful one? Hmm. The knight. The knight hesitating momentarily before his desire for sweet candy won out. Still, perhaps because of his position as a knight, a considerable amount of time passed between the initial nod and when he actually reached out and took a honey drop. A half a day's travel east of here, there's a small village in the mountains. I was trading salt there. Ah, I see you've a load in your cart. Salt as well? No, but first. Look, Lawrence turning around and removing the tarp that covered his load revealing the bundle of magnificent marten pelts. A year's salary of the night before him was paltry compared with its worth. And this? Ah, this is wheat I received from the village. The sheaf of wheat in the corner of the mountain of firs had been harvested in the village where Lawrence had traded his salt. It was hardy in cold weather and resisted insects. He planned to sell it in the northwest, where the crops had sustained heavy frost damage. Very well. You may pass. It was a strange... It was a strange way of speaking for someone who'd summoned him over so high-handedly earlier, but Lawrence were too meekly to say, "Yes, sir." Now a fine merchant he'd be. So, what occasions your posts here, sir? Knight? The knight's brow knitted in the consternation at the question, and furrowed still deeper as he glanced at the bag of honey drops. He was well and truly cut now. Lawrence undid the bag string closure and plucked out another honey sweet, giving it to the knight. Delicious. I should thank you. The knight was being reasonable. Lawrence inclined his head gratefully, using his best trader smile. The monks have caught wind of a big pagan festival that's approaching, thus increased the guard. You know of anything of this festival? If his face had betrayed any hint of his disappointment at the explanation, calling it a third-rate performance would have been generous. So Lawrence only affected a pained expression and answered, "Sadly, I know nothing." This was of course a huge lie, but the knight was just as mistaken, so there was nothing for it. Perhaps it's truly held in secret then. Pagans are a cowardly lot after all. The knight was so mistaken it was amusing, but Lawrence merely agreed and took his leave. The knight nodded and thanked him again for the honey drops. Undoubtedly they had been delicious. Most of the knight's money went to equipment and lodging. Even an apprentice clobber lived a better life. It had surely been a long time since the knight had eaten anything sweet. Not that Lawrence had any intention of giving him another piece. Still, a pagan festival, they say. Lawrence repeated the knight's words to himself once the monastery was well behind him. Lawrence had an inkling of what the knight was talking about. Actually, anyone from this area would know about it, but it was no pagan festival. For one thing, true pagans were farther north. Or farther east. The festival that happened here was hardly something one needed knights to guard against. It was a simple harvest festival, for the sort to be found nearly anywhere. True, this area's festival was somewhat grander than the typical celebration, which is probably why the monastery was keeping an eye out on it and reporting to the city. The church had been unable to keep control over this area, which undoubtedly made it all the more nervous about going ons. Indeed, the church had been eager to hold inquisitions and convert heathens and clash between neutral philosophers and theologians in the city were far from rare. The time when the church could command the populace's unconditional submission was vanishing. The dignity of the institution was beginning to crumble. Even if the inhabitants of the city said nothing, all were gradually beginning to realize it. In fact, the Pope had recently had to petition the monarchs of several nations for funds when the tithes had come in below expectations. Such a tale would have been preposterous even 10 years before. Thus the church was desperate to regain its authority. Business everywhere will suffer, said Lawrence, with a rueful smile, popping another honey drop into his mouth. The western skies were more beautiful golden a more beautiful golden hue than the wheat in the fields by the time Lawrence arrived in the plains. Distant birds became tiny shadows as they hurried home, and here and there the frogs sang themselves to sleep. It had appeared that the wheat fields had been mostly harvested, so the festival would undoubtedly begin soon, perhaps even as soon as the day after tomorrow. Before Lawrence lay an expanse of the village of Pasloe. Pasloe's fertile wheat fields. The more abundant the harvest, the more prosperous the villagers. Furthermore, the noble who managed the land, one Count Arundot, was a famous area eccentric who enjoyed working in the fields himself. Naturally, the festival also enjoyed his support, and every year it was a riot of wine and song. Lawrence had not once participated in it, though. Unfortunately, outsiders were not permitted. "Oh there, good work," Lawrence called out to a farmer driving a cart heaped with wheat in the corner of one of the fields. It was well-ripened wheat. Those who had invested in wheat futures could breathe a sigh of relief. "What's that? Might you tell me where to find Yare?" Yare? Find Yare? Lawrence asked. "Oh, Yare'll be over yonder." "Oh, Yare'll be over yonder. See where the crowd is gathering. That field. It's all youngsters at his place this year. Whoever's the slowest will wind up being the holo." The farmer said good-naturedly, his tanned face smiling. It was the kind of guileless smile a merchant could never manage. Lawrence thanked the farmer with his best trader smile and turned the horse towards Yare's place. Just as the farmers had said, there was a crowd gathering within the confines, and they were shouting something. They seemed to be making sport of a few who were still working in the field. But it wasn't ridicule at their lateness. The jeering was part of the festival. As Lawrence lazily approached the crowd, he was able to make out their shouting. "It's a wolf! It's a wolf! A wolf! A wolf lies there! Who will be the last to catch the wolf? Who? Who? Who?" The villagers shouted, and their faces so cheerful one wondered if they were drunk. None of them noticed Lawrence pulling his cart up behind the crowd. What they so enthusiastically called a wolf was in fact not a wolf at all. Had it been a real one, no one would have been laughing. The wolf was the harvest god, and according to village legend, it resided within the last stalk of wheat to be reaped. Whoever cut that stalk down would be possessed by the wolf, it said. "It's the last bundle. Mind you, don't cut too far. Hollow flees from the greedy hand. Who will catch the wolf? It's Yare! It's Yare! Yare! Yare!" Lawrence got off his wagon and peered into the crowd, just as Yare cut the last bundle of wheat. His face was black with sweat and soil as he grinned hefted the wheat high, threw his back and howled, "Ow! It's hollow, hollow!" Okay. "Hollow the wolf is here! Hollow the wolf is here! Catch it now! Catch it quick! Don't let it escape!" The shouting men suddenly gave chase after Yare. The god of the bountiful harvest, once cornered, would possess a human and try to escape. Capture it and it would remain for another year. None knew if this god truly existed, but this was an old tradition in the area. Lawrence had traveled far and wide, so he put no stock in the teachings of the church. But his faith in superstition was greater than even that of the farmers here. Too many times had he crossed mountains only to arrive in a town and find the price of his goods dropping precipitously. It was enough to make anyone superstitious. Thus he didn't bat an eye at traditions that true believers or church officials would have found outrageous. But it was inconvenient that Yare was this year's hollow. Now Yare would be locked in the granary, stocked with treats until the festival was over, close to a week. And would be impossible to talk to. "Nothing for it, I suppose," said Lawrence, sighing as he returned to his wagon and made for the village's head's resident. He had wanted to enjoy some drinks with Yare and report on the events at the monastery. But if he didn't sell the furs that were piled high in his wagon bed, he wouldn't be able to pay for goods purchased elsewhere when the bills came due. He also wanted to sell the wheat he'd brought from the other village and couldn't wait around the festival for the festival to end. Lawrence talked briefly of the midday's happenings at the monastery to the village head, who was busy with the festival preparation. He politely declined the offer to stay the night and put the wagon behind him. Years before the Count began to manage the region, it had suffered under heavy taxes that drove up the prices of its exports. Lawrence had bought some of this unfavorably priced wheat and sold it for a meager profit. It hadn't done it. It hadn't done it to win favor with the village, but rather simply because he simply didn't have the resources to compete with the other merchants for the cheaper, finer grain. Nevertheless, the village was still grateful for his business then, and Yare had been the middleman for the deal. It was unfortunate that he couldn't enjoy a drink with Yare, but once Holo appeared, Lawrence would soon be chased out of the village as the festival came to its climax. If he'd stayed the night, he wouldn't have been able to stay long. As he sat on his wagon, Lawrence felt a sense of loneliness at being excluded, thus. Nibbling on the vegetables he had been given as a souvenir, he took the road west, passing cheerful farmers returning from their day's work. Having returned to his lonely travel, Lawrence envied the farmers with their friends. Lawrence was a traveling merchant and 25 years old. At 12 he'd apprenticed under a relative. At 18 he'd set out on his own. There were many places he had yet to visit, and he felt that the true test of his mettle as a trader was yet to come. Like any number of traveling merchants, his dream was to save enough money to open up shop in a town, but the dream seemed still distant. Seems still distant. If he could seize upon a good opportunity, it might not be so, but unfortunately the larger traders seized such opportunities with their money. Nevertheless, he hauled loads of goods across the countryside in order to pay his debts in a timely fashion. Even if he saw a good opportunity, he lacked the withdrawal to seize it. To a traveling merchant, such a thing was as unreachable as the moon in the sky. Lawrence looked up at the moon and sighed. He realized such sighs were more frequent lately, whether as a reaction to years of frantic trading simply to make ends meet, or because recently he'd gotten slightly ahead of and was thinking about about the future. Additionally, when he should be thinking about little else besides creditors, payment deadlines, and getting to the next town as quickly as possible. Thoughts chased one another through his head. Specifically, he thought of the people he'd met in his travels. He thought of the merchants he had come to know when visiting a town repeatedly on business, and the villagers he had come acquainted with at his destinations. The maidservant he'd fallen for during a long stay at an inn, waiting for a blizzard to pass, and on and on. In short, he longed for company more and more frequently. Such longing was an occupational hazard for merchants who spent the better part of the year alone in a wagon. But Lawrence had only recently begun to feel it. Until now, he'd always boasted that it would never happen to him. Still, having spent so many days alone with a horse, he started to feel that it would be nice if the horse could speak. Stories of cart horses becoming human were not uncommon amongst traveling merchants, and Lawrence had since the beginning laughed of such yarns as ridiculous. But lately he wondered if they could be true. When a young merchant went to buy a horse of a trader, some Some would even recommend a mare with a completely straight face, just in case she turns human on you. This had happened to Lawrence, who had ignored the advice and bought a sturdy stallion. The same horse was working steadily in front of him, even now. But as time passed and Lawrence grew lonely, he wondered if he might have been better off with a mare at all, after all. On the other hand, the horse hauled heavy loads day in and day out. Even if it were to become human, it seemed impossible that it would fall in love with its master or use its mysterious powers to bring them good fortune. It would probably want to be paid and given rest, Lawrence mused. As soon as this occurred to him, he felt that it was best if a horse stayed a horse. Even if it did make him selfish, Lawrence smiled. Even if it did make him selfish. Lawrence smiled bitterly and sighed as if tired of himself. Presently he came to a river and decided to make camp for the night. The full moon was bright, but that did not guarantee that he wouldn't fall into the river. And if that happened, calling it a disaster would be an understatement. He'd have to hang himself. That kind of trouble he didn't need. Lawrence pulled back on the reins, and the horse stopped at the single, heaving 2 or 3 as it realized its long-anticipated rest was here. Giving the rest of his vegetables to the horse, Lawrence took a bucket out of the wagon bed and drew some water from the river, setting it before the animal. As it happily slurped at the bucket, Lawrence drank some of the water he'd gotten from the village. Wine would have been nicer, but drinking without a partner only made the loneliness worse. There was no guarantee he wouldn't get staggering drunk either, so Lawrence decided to go to bed. He'd half-heartedly nibbled on the vegetables most of the way, so he only had a bit of beef before hopping back in the wagon bed. Normally he slept in the hempen tarp that covered the bed, but tonight he had a wagon load of marten pelts, so it would be a waste not to sleep in them. They might make him smell a bit beastly in the morning, but that was better than freezing. But jumping into the pelts would crush the wheat sheaf, so in order to move them aside he whisked the tarp off the wagon bed. The only reason he didn't shout was because the sight that greeted him was flatly unbelievable. Apparently, he had a guest. Hey! Lawrence wasn't sure his voice actually made a sound. He was shocked and wondered if the loneliness had finally broken him and he was hallucinating. But after he shook his head and rubbed his eyes, his guest had not disappeared. There was a beautiful girl. She was sleeping so soundly it seemed a shame to wake her. Hey, you there, said Lawrence nonetheless, returning to his senses. He meant to inquire what exactly would motivate someone to sleep in a wagon bed. In the worst case, it might have been a runaway. He didn't want that kind of trouble. Came the girl's defenseless response to Lawrence, her eyes still closed, her voice so sweet that it would make a poor traveling merchant accustomed to only brothels of the city light-hearted. She had a terrifying allure, despite her obvious youth, nestled in there in the firs and illuminated by the moonlight. Lawrence gulped once before returning to reason. Given that she was so beautiful, if she was a prostitute, there was no telling how much he could be taken for if he was so much to touch her. Considering the economics of the situation, was a tonic far. More effective than any prayer, Lawrence gained his composure and raised his voice once again. You there? What are you playing at? Sleeping in someone's cart? The girl did not awaken. Fed up with this girl who slept so obstinately, Lawrence grabbed the pelt that supported her head and jerked it out from under her. The girl's head flopped into the gap left by the pelt, and finally he heard an irritated squeak. He was about to raise his voice again, but then he froze. The young girl had dog ears on her head? Now that the girl seemed to be finally awake, Lawrence summoned his courage and spoke again. You there? What are you doing, climbing in my wagon bed? Lawrence had been robbed more than once by thieves and bandits as he crossed the countryside. He considered himself bolder and more courageous than the average person. He wasn't one to quail just because the girl in front of him happened to have ears of an animal. Despite the fact that the girl hadn't answered his question, Lawrence did not pose them again. This was because the girl, slowly awakening before him and entirely naked, was unspeakably beautiful. Her hair, illuminated by the moonlight in the wagon, looked as soft as silk and fell over her shoulders. Like the finest cloak, the strands that fell down her neck to her collarbone drew a line so beautiful it put the finest painting of the Virgin Mary to shame. Her supple arms were so fine they seemed carved from ice. And composed now in the middle of her body were two small breasts, so beautiful they gave the impressions of being carved from some inorganic material. She gave off a strangely vital sense, as if housed within her arresting charm was a warmth. But such a fascinating spectacle could only just as soon go awry. The girl slowly opened her mouth and looked skyward. Closing her eyes, she howled, "Howoo!" Lawrence felt a sudden fear. It blew through his body like a wind. The howl was the song of a wolf would use to call its comrades to chase and corner a human. This was no howl like Yurei had uttered earlier. It was a true howl. Lawrence dropped the bite of his beef from his mouth. His horse reared startled. And then he realized something. The moonlit girl's form, with the ears on her head, the ears of a beast. 'Tis a good moon. Have you no wine? Oh, 'tis a good moon. Have you no wine? She said, letting the howl fade away, drawing her chin up and smiling slightly. Lawrence came back to himself at the sound of her voice. What was before him was neither a dog nor a wolf. It was a beautiful girl with the ears of such an animal, though. I have none. What are you, and why are you sleeping in my cart? Were you to be sold in town? Did you escape? Lawrence meant to ask as authoritatively as he could, but the girl did not so much as move. What? You have no wine? Food then? My, such a waste, said the girl unconcernedly, her nose twitching. She spied the bit of beef Lawrence had almost eaten earlier, snapping it up and popping it in her mouth. As she chewed, Lawrence did not fail to note the two sharp fangs behind the girl's lips. Are you some kind of demon? He asked, his hand falling to the dagger at his waist. As traveling merchants often needed to convert large amounts of currency, they often carried their money in forms of items. The silver dagger was one such item, and silver was known as a holy metal, strong against evil. Strong against evil. However, when Lawrence put his hand to the dagger and posed his question to the girl, the girl looked blankly at him, then laughed heartedly. Me, a demon? Now. Her mouth opened wide enough to drop the piece of meat. The girl was so adorable as to be disarming. Her two sharp fangs only added to her charm. However, being laughed at made Lawrence angry. How is that so amusing? Oh, oh, it's amusing, it is. That is surely the first time I've been called a demon. Still, giggling to herself, the girl picked up the meat again and chewed it. She did have fangs, and in her ears, and it was clear enough that she was no mere human. What are you? Me? Who but you would I be talking about? Who talking to? The horse? When Lars drew his dagger, the girl's smile disappeared. Her red-tinged amber eyes narrowed. What are you, I say? Drawing a blade on me now? How lacking in manners. What? I see my escape was successful. My apologies. I had forgotten, said the girl with a smile, and completely guileless and charming smile. The smile didn't particularly sway him, but nevertheless Lawrence somehow felt that pointing the blade at the girl was an unseemly thing to do. A thing for a man to do. So he put it away. I am called Hollow. It has been some time since I've been taken this form, but, well, it's quite nice. As the girl looked herself over approvingly, Lawrence was so caught on the first half of what she said that she missed the second half. Hollow? Hollow. A good name, no? Lawrence had traveled far and wide over many lands, but there was only one place where he'd heard that name. None other than the harvest god of the village of Pasloe. What a coincidence. I also know of one that goes by Hollow. It wasn't bold to use the name of the god, but at least this told him that she was indeed the girl from the village. Perhaps he'd been hidden, raised in secret by her family because of her ears and her fangs. That would fit with her claim to have escaped successfully. Lawrence had heard talk of abnormal children being born. They were called demon children, and it was thought that the devil or spirit had possessed them at birth. If the church discovered them, they, and along with their families, would be burned at the stake for demon worshipping. Such children were thus either abandoned in the mountains or raised in secret. But this was the first time Lawrence had ever seen such a child. He'd always assumed that they would be disgustingly bestial, but judging by the from appearance alone, this was a plausible goddess. Oh, have you? I have never met. Oh, I've never met another Holo. Whence do they hail? As the girl chewed on the meat, it was harder to see her trying to deceive anyone. It seemed possible that, having been raised in confinement for so long, she did believe herself to be a god. It is the name of this area's harvest god. Are you a god? At this, the girl's moonlit face was slightly troubled for a moment before she smiled. I have long been bound to this place and called it God, but I am nothing so great as a deity. I am merely hollow. Lawrence guessed that this meant she'd been locked away in her home since she was born. He felt a certain sympathy for the girl. By long, you mean that you were born here? Oh no. This was an unexpected answer. I was born far to the north. The north? Indeed, the summers there are short and the winters long. A world of silver. Hollow's eyes narrowed as she seemed to gaze into the distance. It was hard to imagine that she was lying. Her behavior as she reminiscent about the lands of the north was too natural to be an act. Have you ever been there? Lawrence wondered if she was counterattacking, but if Hollow was merely lying or merely repeating things she'd heard from others, he would have been able to tell immediately. His travels as a merchant had in fact led him to the far north before. I've been as far as Arohitostok. Arohitostok. The year-round blowing snow is terrifying. Haven't heard of it, replied Hollow, inclining her head slightly. He'd expected her to pretend to have knowledge. This was strange. What places do you know? He asked. A place called Yoitsu. Lawrence forced himself to say I don't know it, to quell the unease that rose within him. He did know of a place called Yoitsu from an old story he'd heard at an inn in the north. Were you born there? I was. How is Yoitsu in these days? Is everyone well? Hollow asked, slumping slightly. It was such a fleeting gesture that it couldn't be an act. Yet Lawrence could not possibly believe her. After all, according to the story, the town of Yoitsu had been destroyed by Ursine monsters 600 years ago. Do you remember any other places? It's been so many centuries. Nyohira. There was a town called Nyohira. It was a strange town, with hot springs. I would often go bathe in them. There were still hot springs in the north at Nyohira, where royalty and nobility often visited. But how many people in the area would even know of its existence? Ignoring Lawrence's confused reverie, Hollow spoke as if she were even now relaxing in hot water. Then suddenly she sneezed. I do not mind taking human form, but it's avoidably cold. Not enough fur, said Hollow, laughing and hiding herself in a pile of marten pelts. Lawrence couldn't help laughing at her appearance. There was something that still worried him, though he spoke to Hollow as she snuggled into the fur pile. You said something about changing forms earlier. What was that about? At his question, Hollow poked her head out of the pile. I mean, what I said. I haven't taken human form in some time. Charming, no? she said with a smile. Lawrence couldn't help agreeing, but he kept a straight face as he replied. The girl made him lose his composure, that was certain. Aside from a few extra details, you're a human. Or what else? Are you a dog turned human? Like the stories of horses turning human? Holo stood at the slight provocation, turning her back to him. She looked over her shoulder and at him and responded steadily. You can doubtless tell from my ears and my tail that I am a proud wolf. My fellow wolves, the animals of the forest, and the people of the village all acknowledge me. It is of the white tip of my tail that I am the proudest. My ears anticipate every misfortune and hear every lie, and I have saved many friends from many dangers. Where one speaks of the wise wolf of Yoitze, they speak of none other than me. Holo sniffed proudly, but soon remembered the cold and dove back under the furs. The tail at the base of her back was indeed moving. Not just ears, then. She had a tail as well. Lawrence thought back on her howl. If it was true, if it was true, it was a true wolf's howl, unmistakably. Was this then truly Holo, wolf god of the harvest? No, it can't be, muttered Lawrence to himself as he reconsidered Holo. She seemed unconcerned about him and narrowed her eyes in the warm furs. Seen thus, she was rather cat-like, although that was not the issue at hand. Was Holo human, or wasn't she? That was the question. People who were actually possessed by demons didn't fear the church because their appearance was different. Rather, they feared it because the demon within could cause onward calamities, for which the church made it widely known as the penalty was death at the stake. But if Holo was instead a transformed animal like the old tales, she might bring good fortune or perform miracles. Indeed, if she was the Holo, god of the harvest, a wheat trader could ask for no finer companion. Lawrence turned his attention back to Holo. Holo, was it? Yes. You said you were a wolf. I did. But all you have are wolf's ears and a tail. If you truly are a transformed wolf, should you be able to take a wolf's form? Holo stared absently for a while at Lawrence's words before something seemed to occur to her. Oh, you're telling me to show my wolf form? Lawrence nodded at the truth of the statement, but was in fact mildly surprised. He had expected her to either be flustered or flatly lie, but she had done neither. Instead, looking simply irritated, this expression of irritation was far from persuasive other than the clumsy lie. The assurance that she could transform that he expected. I don't want to, she said plainly. Why not? Why do you want me? She shot back, pouting. Lawrence winced at her retort, but the question of whether Holo was human or not was an important one for him. Recovering from his stumble, Lawrence put as much confidence as he could muster into his voice, trying to regain the conversational initiative. If you were a person, I would consider turning you into the church. Demons cause calamity after all. But if you are really Holo, god of the harvest, in human form, then I needn't turn you in. Were she genuine, well, tales of transformed animals acting in voice of good fortune still remained. Far from turning her into a demon, he would happily offer her wine and bread. If not, the situation would be different. As Lauren spoke, Hollow wrinkled her nose and her expression grew darker and darker. From what I've heard, transformed animals... From what I've heard, transformed animals can change into their original forms. If you're telling the truth, you should be able to do so as well, yes? Hollow listened with the same irritated expression. At length, she sighed softly and slowly extracted herself from the pile of furs. I have suffered many times at the hands of the church. I'll not be given over to them yet. She sighed again, stroking her tail as she continued. No animal can change its form without a token. Even you humans need makeup before you can change your appearance. Likewise, I require food. What kind of food? Only a bit of wheat. That seemed more or less reasonable for a god of the harvest. Lawrence had to admit, but her statement brought him short. That or fresh blood? Fresh blood? Only a bit though. Her casual tone made Lawrence feel that she couldn't be lying. His breath caught and he glanced at her mouth. But just a moment ago he'd seen the fangs behind those lips bite into some meat. He dropped. What? Are you afraid? Said Hollow at Lawrence's trepidation. As she smiled ruefully, Lawrence would have said, of course not, but Hollow was clearly anticipating his reaction. But as soon as the smile disappeared from her face, she looked away from him. If you are, then I'm even more disinclined to. Why then? Lawrence asked, putting more strength into his voice, feeling that he was being made a sport of. Because you surely will quake with fear, be they human or animal. Look on my form and give away with awe, and treat me as special. I'm tired of this treatment. Are you saying I would be afraid of your true form? If you would pretend to be strong, you might at first hide your trembling hand, Hollow said exasperated. Lawrence looked down at his hands, but by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. You're an honest sort, said an amused Hollow. But before Lawrence could offer an excuse, her expression darkened again, as she continued, quick as an arrow. However, just because you are honest doesn't mean I should show you my form. Was what you said before the truth? Before? That if I am truly a wolf, you would not give me to the church? Lawrence had heard that there were demons capable of illusions, so this was not a decision he could make lightly. Hollow seemed to anticipate this and spoke again. Well, I have a good eye for both men and beasts. You are a man who keeps his word, I can tell. Lawrence was still unable to find his tongue at the mischievous Hollow's words. He certainly could go back to on his word. He was understanding more and more that she was toying with him. But there was nothing he could do about it. I'll show you a bit then. A full transformation is difficult. You'll forgive me if I only do my arm? Said Hollow, reaching down into the corner of the wagon. For a moment Lawrence thought that it was some sort of special pose she had to assume, but he soon realized that what she was doing was picking a grain of wheat from the sheaf in the corner of the wagon. "Oh, what are you doing with that?" asked Lawrence without thinking. Before he could even finish the question, Hollow popped the grain of wheat in her mouth and, closing her eyes, swallowing it like a pill. The shell of the unhusked kernel was not edible. Lawrence frowned at the thought of the bitter taste in his mouth, but that soon vanished at the sight of what came next. Hollow groaned, clutching her left arm and falling into the pile of furs. Lawrence was about to say something. This could not be an act, when a strange sound reached his ears. It was like the sound of mice running through the forest. It continued for a few moments, then ended with a muffled thud, like something threaded on soft ground. Lawrence was so surprised he could do nothing. The next moment, Hollow's formerly slim arm had transformed into the forepaw of a huge beast, and was totally unsuited to the rest of her body. Phew. It really doesn't look very good. The limb had appeared to be so large that she would have trouble supporting it. She rested the giant leg on the pile of furs and shifted herself to accommodate it. "Well, do you believe me now?" She looked up at Lawrence. Lawrence was unable to reply, rubbing his eyes and shaking his head as he looked again at the sight before him. The leg was magnificent, coated with dark brown fur. Given the size of the leg, the full animal would be huge, roughly as big as a horse. The paw ended in a huge scythe-like claws, and all that grew from the girl's slender shoulder. It would be strange to think it was an illusion. Unable to believe it, Lawrence finally took a skin of water and doused his face with it. "Aren't you a doubtful one? If you think it's still an illusion, go ahead and touch it," teased Hollow, smiling, curling the giant paw in a come hither motion. Lawrence found himself irritated, yet he still hesitated. Besides the sheer size of the limb, it also gave off a certain ineffable sense of danger. It was the leg of a wolf. I've dealt with goods called dragon legs. Lawrence told himself, irritated at his cowardice, and just before his hand could touch it, "Oh," said Hollow, seeming to remember something. Lawrence snapped his hand back. What is it?" "Oh, nothing. Don't be so surprised," said Hollow, now sounding annoyed. Adding embarrassment to his fear, Lawrence became angrier and angrier at what he felt was his failure as a man. Getting hold of himself, he reached out once again. "So, what happened?" said Hollow meekly, looking up at Lawrence. "Be gentle, will you?" Lawrence couldn't help stopping his hand short at her suddenly endearing manner. He looked at her, and she looked back grinning. "You're rather charming, aren't you?" she said. Lawrence said nothing, as he made sure of what his hand was feeling. He was irritated at her half-teasing manner, but there was another reason he failed to reply. It was, of course, because of what he was touching. The beast leg had thrust from Hollow's shoulder a bone as thick and solid as a tree's limber, wrapping in sinew that would be the envy of any soldier. And covering that the magnificent coat of brown fur. From the base of the shoulder all the way down to the paw, each pad of the paw was the size of an uncut loaf of bread. Past the soft pinky toes that was something denser, the scythes of her claws. The leg was solid enough, but those claws were anything but illusory. The addition to the not warm yet not cold sensation peculiar to animal claws, Lawrence felt a thrill at the sensation that these were not something he should be touching. He swallowed. "Are you really a god?" he murmured. "I'm no god. As you can tell from my forepaw, I'm merely bigger than my comrades. Bigger and cleverer. I am Holo, the wise wolf." The girl who so confidently called herself wise looked at Lawrence proudly. She was every bit a mischievous young girl, but the aura that the beast limb exuded was not something a mere animal could ever manage. It had nothing to do with the size of the thing, so what do you think? Lawrence nodded vaguely at her question. But the real Holo should be in Yare now. The wolf resides in the one who cut the last wheat stalk, they say. I am Holo the Wise Wolf. I know well my own limitations. It's true that I live in the wheat. Without it, I cannot live. And it is also true that during the harvest, I was within the last wheat to be harvested. And usually I cannot escape from there, not while anywhere washing. However, there was an exception. Lawrence listened to her explanation, impressed with her rapid delivery. If there is nearby a larger sheaf of wheat than that of the last one harvested, I can move unseen to that wheat. That is why they say it. You know, the villagers. If you cut too greedily, you won't catch the harvest god, and it will escape. Lawrence glanced at his wagon bed with a sudden realization. There was a sheaf of wheat, and the wheat he'd received from the mountain village. So that is how it was done. I suppose one could call you my savior. If you hadn't been there, I would have never escaped. Although Lawrence could not quite bring himself to believe those words, they were lent persuasion when Holo swallowed a few more wheat grains and returned her arm to normal. However, Holo had said savior with a certain distaste, so Lawrence decided to get even with her. Perhaps I should take you back. I should take that wheat back to the village then. They'll be in a bad way without their harvest gods. I've been friends with Yarai and the others in Pasloe for a long time. I'd hate to see them suffer. He concocted the pretense on the spot, but the more he thought about it, the truer it seemed. If this Holo was the real Holo, then wouldn't the village begin suffering poor harvests? After a few moments, this reminiscence ended. Holo was looking at him as if stricken. Y- You're dressing, surely? She said. Her suddenly frail mien rocked the defenseless merchant. Hard to say, Lawrence said vaguely, trying to conceal his internal conflict and buy some time. Even even as his head filled with other concerns, his heart grew only more uneasy. Lawrence agonized. If Holo was what she claimed to be, the god of the harvest, his best course of action would be to return her to the village. He had been long associated with Pasloe. He did not wish them ill. However, when he looked back at Holo, her earlier bravado was entirely gone. Now she looked down, as apprehensive as any princess in an old night tale. Lawrence grimaced and put the question to himself. Should I return this girl to the village, even though she clearly does not want to go? What if she is the real Holo? He muttered the matter over in a cold sweat, the two questions battling in his mind. Presently, he became aware of someone looking at him. He followed the look to its source and saw Holo gazing at him beseechingly. Please help me, won't you? Unable to stand the sight of Holo so meekly bowing her head, Lawrence turned away. All he saw day in, day out was the backside of the horse. The life left him completely unable to resist a girl like Holo looking at him with such a face. Agonizingly, he came to a decision. He turned slowly back towards Holo and asked her to a single question. I must ask you one thing. Alright? If you leave the village, will they be able to raise wheat? He didn't expect Holo to answer the way that would weaken her own position, but he was a merchant. He had dealt with a number of dishonest negotiators in time. He had confidence that if Holo attempted to lie, he would know. Lawrence readied himself to catch the prevarication that he was sure would come, but come it didn't. When he looked at her, she swore an expression completely different from what he'd seen so far. She looked angry and near tears. Tears as she stared into the corner of the wagon bed. What's wrong? Lawrence had asked. The village's abundant harvest will continue without me. She spat, her voice surprisingly irritated. Is that so? Asked Lawrence, overwhelmed by the piercing anger that emanated from Holo. Holo nodded, squaring her shoulders. She gripped the furs tightly, her hand white from effort. Long did I stay in that village, as many years as I have hairs on my tail. Eventually I wished to leave, but for the sake of the village's wheat, I stayed. Long ago, you see, I made a promise with a youth of the village that I would ensure the village's harvest, and so I kept my promise. Perhaps because she couldn't stomach it, she did not so much as look at Lawrence as she spoke. Earlier, her wit and words had been quick and easy. Now she stumbled uncertainly. I am a wolf that lives in wheat. My knowledge of wheat, of things that grow in the ground, is second to none. That is why I made the village's fields so magnificent, as I promised, but to do that, occasionally the harvest must be poor. Forcing the land to produce requires compensation. But whenever the harvest was poor, the villagers attributed to my caprices. And it had only gotten worse in recent years. I had been wanting to leave. I can stand it no longer. Long ago I fulfilled my promise. Lawrence understood Holo's anger. Some years ago, Pasloe had come under the care of Count Erendot, and since the new farming techniques had been imported from the south, increasing yield. Thus Holo felt that her presence was no longer necessary. Indeed, the rumor was proliferating that not even the god of the church existed. It was not impossible that the countryside hamlet's harvest god had gotten wrapped up in such talk. The village's good harvest will continue. There will be a poor yield every few years, but that will be their own doing, and they'll overcome it on their own. The land doesn't need me, and the people certainly don't need me either. Getting her words out all in one breath, Holo sighed deeply and fell over on the pile of furs yet again. She curled up, pulling the furs around her and burying her face in them. She could not see her face to. He could not see her face to make certain, but it seemed not impossible that she was crying. Lawrence scratched his head, unsure of what to say. He looked helplessly at her slender shoulders and wolf hairs. Perhaps this was how a real god acted. Now full of bluster and bravado, now wielding a sharp wit, now showing a childish temper. Lawrence was at a loss at how to treat the girl now. Nevertheless, he couldn't very well remain silent, so he took a new approach. In that case, setting aside the question of whether or not that's all true, you think of me a liar? Snapped Holo as his preamble. He faltered, but Holo seemed to realize that she herself was being too emotional. She stopped, abashed, and muttered quick sorry, before burying her head in the furs again. Okay, I understand your resentment, but where do you plan to go, having left the village? She did not answer immediately, but Lawrence saw her ears prick at his question, so she waited patiently. She had just delivered a significant confession, and Lawrence expected that she simply couldn't face anyone for a moment. At length, Holo guiltily looked into the corner of the wagon bed, confirming Lawrence's suspicion. I wish to return north, she said flatly. North? Holo nodded, turning her gaze up and off into the distance. Lawrence didn't have to follow to know where she was looking. True north. My birthplace, the forests of Yoitsu. So many years have passed, and I can no longer count them. I wish to return home. The word of birthplace had left Lawrence momentarily shocked, and he looked at Holo's profile. He himself had not visited his hometown since his embarking on the life of a wandering merchant. It was a poor and cramped place of which he had few good memories, but after long days in the driver's seat, sometimes loneliness overcame him, and he couldn't help thinking fondly of the place. If Holo was telling the truth, not only had she left her home hundreds of years ago, but she'd endured neglect and ridicule at the place where she'd settled. He could guess at her loneliness. But I'd like to travel a bit. I've come all the way to this distant place after all, and surely much has changed over the months and years. So it would be good to broaden my perspective, said Holo. Looking at Lawrence, looking at Lawrence, her face a picture of calm. So long as you'll not take me back to Pasloe or turn me into the church, I'd like to travel with you. You're a wandering merchant, aren't you? She regarded Lawrence with a friendly smile and suggested she'd seen right through him. And he knew he would not betray her. She sounded like an old friend asking a simple favor. Lawrence had yet to determine whether or not to believe Hollow's words. But as far as he could tell, she was not a bad sort. And he'd begun to enjoy conversing with this strange girl. But he wasn't so won over by her charm as to forget his merchant's instincts. A good merchant has the audacity to face a god and the caution to doubt a close relative. Lawrence thought it over and then spoke quietly. I cannot make this decision quickly. He expected complaint, but had underestimated Holo. She nodded in comprehension. It is good to be cautious, but I never misread a person. I don't believe you're so called to turn someone away. Holo spoke with a mischievous smile playing across her lips. She then turned and hopped back into the pile of furs, albeit without the sulkiness she'd shown before. It seemed as though she was saying, enough talk for today. She derailed of the conversation yet again. Lawrence could only grin in spite of himself as he watched Holo. He thought he could see her ears moving and her head popped out of as she looked at him. Surely you'll not tell me to sleep outside? She said, obviously aware that he could not do no such thing. Lawrence shrugged. Holo giggled and returned into the fur pile. Seeing her like this, Lawrence wondered if her actions earlier were something of an act, as if she was trying to play the part of imprisoned princess. Nevertheless, he doubted that her dissatisfaction with the village or her desire to return home were lies. And if those weren't lies, then he must believe that she was the real Holo. Because a mere demon-possessed girl would not be able to make it all up. Lawrence sighed as he realized that more thought would not yield any new answers. He decided to go to sleep and leave further ruminations for tomorrow. The furs that Holo slept in belonged to Lawrence. It was ludicrous to think that their owner would forgo their comfort and sleep on the wagon's driving bench, telling her to move to one side. He too snuggled into the fur pile. From behind him he heard the quiet sounds of Holo's breathing, although he told her he couldn't make a quick decision. Lawrence had already decided that as long as Holo had not made up with his goods in the morning, he would travel with her. He doubted that she was that sort of troublemaker, but if she was, he thought she would surely make off with his entire load. He looked forward to the next day. After all, it had been a long time since he'd slept beside another. It was impossible to be unhappy with her slightly sweet piercing, sweet scent piercing the strong smelling furs. The horse heaved a sigh, as if reading Lawrence's simple thought. Perhaps horses really could understand humans and simply preferred not to speak. Lawrence grinned ruefully and closed his eyes. Lawrence rose early in the morning. He was like most merchants who awoke early in order to extract the most profit from the day. However, when he opened his eyes to the morning mist, Holo was already up, sitting next to him and rummaging through something. For an instant, Lawrence wondered if his estimation of her had been wrong, but if so, she was truly audacious. He raised his head and looked over his shoulder. It appeared she had gone looking for clothes among the things and was just now tying her shoes. Hey now, those are mine. Even if it wasn't actual theft, even a god shouldn't be rummaging through other people's things. Holo turned around at Lawrence's rebuke, but there was not so much as a trace of guilt on her face. Oh, you're awake? What do you think of this? Does it look good? She asked, completely unconcerned as she spread her arms, far from chestnut. She seemed actually proud. Seeing her like this made the uncertain over what Holo of yesterday seemed like something out of a dream. Indeed, it seemed like the real Holo, and the one he'd have to contend with from here on out. Was this impudent prancing thing. Incidentally, the clothes she wore now were Lawrence's best. The one outfit he'd reserved for negotiations with rich traders, and this and the like. The top was an indigo blue shirt underneath a 3/4 length vest. The trousers were a rare combination of linen and leather, with a skirt that wrapped fully around her lower body, with a fine sheepskin sash. The boots were a rare prize, made of tanned leather and triple layered, even good in snowy mountains. Over all this, she wore a bearskin grey coat. Merchants take pride in their practical, dignified clothing. To buy these, Lawrence had saved gradually, beginning in his apprenticeship. It had taken him 10 years. If he showed up to negotiations wearing these with a nicely groomed beard, it would have taken most people at a disadvantage. And now Holo wore those garments. He couldn't find himself to be angry with her, though. All the clothes were clearly too big for her, which made it all the more charming. The grey coat is black. My brown hair looks lovely against it, eh? These trousers, though, they get in the way of my tail. Might I put a hole in them? The trousers she spoke of so lightly had been made by a master craftsman. Only after a significant effort on Lawrence's part, a hole would likely prove impossible to repair. He shook his head resolutely. Well, fortunately, they're still large. I'll find a way to work with them. Holo seemed not to harbor the faintest concern that she would be asked to take the clothes off. Lawrence didn't think she was likely to run away while wearing them, but nevertheless he rose and regarded her. If she were to go to the city and sell them, they could fetch a tidy amount of gold. You're a merchant through and through, that's for sure. That's sure enough. I know just what you anticipated with that expression on your face. Holo said Holo, smiling. She jumped slightly down from the wagon. Her movements were so amusing and natural that he had no reaction. If she'd run just then, he would have been unable to pursue, or perhaps he didn't react because he didn't believe she would run. I'll not run. If that had been my aim, I'd been gone long since. Lawrence glanced at the wheat sheaf in the wagon bed, then looked back at the smiling Holo. She took the bearskin off and tossed it back into the wagon. Evidently, the cloak, which had been made for Lawrence's height, was too big for her. She was even smaller than he'd realized yesterday. Having, having seen her only in the dim moonlight, Lawrence... Lawr- uh, having seen her only in the dim moonlight... Lawrence was on the tall side, but even so, she was too fully head. She was fully 2 heads shorter than him. Then, as she verified the fit of the clothes, she spoke offhandedly. So, I wish to travel with you. May I? She smiled, but did not seem to flatter. If she tried to flatter him, Lawrence felt there might have been a reason to refuse her, but she simply smiled happily. Lawrence sighed. She didn't seem to be a thief, at least. He couldn't let his guard, He couldn't let his guard down, but it wouldn't hurt for her to come along, and sending her away would only make the constant loneliness harder to bear. This must be some kind of fate. Very well, Lawrence said. Oh yeah. Holla did not appear especially overjoyed. She merely smiled. You'll have to earn your keep, though. The life of a merchant isn't easy. I expect the god of abundant harvest to bring an abundant harvest to my coin purse. I'm not so shameless as to thoughtlessly freeload. I'm Holo, the wise wolf, and I have my pride, said Holo sullenly. Lawrence was not so blind as to think she was making a show of childish indignation, though. Sure enough, Holo chuckled. Though this proud wolf made a bit of a spectacle of herself. Oh, though this proud wolf made a bit of a spectacle of herself yesterday. Oh, though this proud wolf made a bit of a spectacle of herself yesterday, she said self-deprecatingly, as if her flustered demeanor reflected her true feelings. In any case, it is good to meet you, Lawrence. Craft Lawrence. I'm working, when I'm working, I go by Lawrence. Lawrence. I shall sing your praise for all eternity, said Holo, with chest thrust forward, her wolf ears prickling up proudly. She seemed oddly serious. It was difficult to tell if she was being childish or cunning. She was like an ever-changing mountain weather. Apparently, that ever-changing mood was part of her craftiness. Lawrence hastily revised his opinion and offered his hand from the wagon bed. It was proof that he truly acknowledged her presence as a companion. Holo smiled and took the hand. Her hand was small and warm. At any rate, it will rain soon. We should make haste. What? You should have said so sooner. What? You should have said so sooner, exclaimed Lawrence, loudly enough to startle the horse. The previous night hadn't brought up so much as a hint of rain, but looking up at the sky, he could indeed see clouds beginning to gather. Holo chuckled at him as he hurriedly made preparations to depart. She scampered on the board wagon, and it was obvious from the ease. And it was obvious from the ease with she rearranged the slept-in first that she would be more handy than some fresh-faced apprentice child. The river is in a foul temper. It would be best to cross a short distance from here. After Lawrence roused the horse, collected the bucket and took the reins in hand, Holo joined him in the driver's seat. It was too big for one person. But slightly too small for two. But to ward off the chill, too small was just right. With the nigh horse, the pair's travels had begun. Phew. All right, that's enough. Leuk boek. Mooi zo. Ik kreeg altijd al te horen dat ik luisterboeken moet gaan inspreken, alleen ik heb moeite met lezen. Alright, ik ga de hond uitlaten, dus ik ga hem stoppen. So, sayonara. またね。